Thank you everyone for your patience and good morning. Thanks for joining us today for today's event celebrating the Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Please be advised that attendees are in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A tool located at the bottom of the Zoom window. With that said, I'll now turn the call over to Jim Johnson, President and CEO of Post & Shell PC. Jim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today to celebrate and recognize the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Before we begin the program, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our distinguished guests and speakers, Cathleen Cahill and Lauren Christella. Thank you for joining us today and providing us with your knowledge, perspective, and insight on this important anniversary. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Women of Post Schell for organizing today's event, especially the efforts of Jessica Rogers and Putty Toland. I'd also like to thank Paul Johnson for his behind-the-scenes hard work and effort in pulling this all together. Paul is our Director of Communications. And a final note, briefly, in these challenging times, we were extremely gratified and heartened to see such a strong response to today's event and to have so many of our clients, legal and business colleagues, members of academia and government, and friends come together to celebrate this anniversary with us. So thank you all very much. And with that said, I'll turn things over to Jessica Rogers, who will get the celebration started and introduce today's first speaker. Thank you again.
Jim, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Post & Shell for hosting this celebration. Today marks a momentous day in American history. 100 years ago today, the final votes were cast so that millions of American citizens could be granted the right to vote for the first time in this country's history. Specifically, the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, enfranchised 26 million American women to vote in the presidential election to be held in November 1920, the single largest enfranchisement in the history of the United States. August 18, 1920 was a momentous day for American women. However, it was the culmination of decades of hard work. The women's suffrage movement in America began in 1848 when there were only 12 amendments to the Constitution. It took more than 70 years of advocacy and protest in the face of tremendous opposition and many incremental victories to achieve the passage of the 19th Amendment and the goal of full suffrage for American women. In those 70 years, America fought the Civil War and World War I, passed 6 other constitutional amendments, and saw significant social and cultural changes, including the addition of 17 new states, the invention of the automobile, and the rise of the industrial era. Today, we celebrate the struggle, the sacrifice, and the hard-fought battles that culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago today. Our first speaker, Professor Cathleen Cahill, is here to help us appreciate the tremendous effort that went into the passage of the 19th Amendment. Professor Cahill is currently an Associate Professor of History at Penn State University. She is the award-winning author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service. Prior to joining the faculty at Penn State, Professor Cahill taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years. She obtained her PhD in history from the University of Chicago. Professor Cahill is a social historian who explores the everyday experiences of ordinary people, primarily women. She focuses on women's working and political lives, asking how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. Professor Cahill is currently working on a book focusing on the role that women of color played in helping all women obtain the right to vote. The book, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, is expected to be out this fall. Professor Cahill is a California native with a passion for history. While she'd always been interested in teaching women's history, it was her time at the University of New Mexico that really made Professor Cahill focus on whose stories we tell. She came across the story of Native suffragist Marie Bottineau Baldwin, and it inspired her to focus on the stories of Native American women and women of color. To remind you that the moment in history we are celebrating today is not too distant, Professor Cahill's maternal grandmother, Edith Jennings, is a spry 102 years old this year. She was born before American women had universal suffrage. And reminding us that the history of the ratification of the 19th Amendment is complicated, Edith was born in Oregon, a state where women were granted full voting rights in 1912, 8 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, after the issue had appeared on the Oregon state ballot 6 times over the course of 28 years. Professor Cahill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Jessica, thank you so much for inviting me. I am really excited to be here with everyone to celebrate what, as you say, is an incredibly momentous moment in American history. And I am excited to talk about, as you say, the complicated and long fight for the right to vote, one that doesn't end in 1920. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. There's a lot. I'm happy to answer anything in questions. But let me get to the screen share here. And all right. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so a short history, but nonetheless. So as Jessica said, what happened today is that the state of Tennessee became what suffragists called the perfect 36th, the last state needed to ratify the 19th Amendment and make it part of the Constitution. And as you know, the amendment enshrined a number of important protections, but it didn't grant the right to vote. It eliminates the restriction of suffrage on the basis of sex. And it was the culmination of an incredibly long struggle that reached back over multiple generations. And I wanted to start just to give you this image. If you put in suffragist into Google, Google Images, this is what you get. And these are great images, I love them, but the story is more complex than this. Most of these are from the last few years of the suffrage struggle, the struggle for ratification, and they don't portray the variety of women who fought for the right to vote, or even the generations of women. You'll see that I think every woman in these pictures is a white woman. And again, this is sort of the image that we have. But women fought for decades, and again, multiple generations. And the 19th Amendment was an incredible victory, a major victory to be sure, but it was not a final victory. The question of women voting has been around as long as the Constitution. Initially, most questions of suffrage, certainly in the early colonial period and then right after the Revolution, often had to do with property rights. If you had property, you could vote. So we know that New Jersey, in their first state constitution, enfranchised women briefly for about a decade. From 1797 to 1807, women could vote in New Jersey until they changed it to say only white men could vote there. And in that early 19th century, there really developed the idea that women, the ideal woman was outside politics, that by being uncorrupted by the political sphere, women could offer a greater influence and really be the moral voice of the American nation, but that being part of politics would really sully that. And so this was the argument about women's moral suasion. But there are two moments of activism in the 1830s, so in this antebellum period, that led a number of women to to question this. And I want to mention them very briefly just to give you a sense of this bigger political activism women are participating in. The first one was the Cherokee removal activism. Because of missionary work in the Cherokee Nation, in the state of what becomes the state of Georgia, white women in the North become very involved in petitioning against Cherokee removal. And they're actually drawing their example from Cherokee women who were petitioning themselves. And enormous numbers of women become sort of active and begin to think about how to influence politics for the first time through this activism, bringing these petitions around to their friends or through their church groups and asking people to sign them and be in solidarity with Cherokee women. The other that you're probably quite familiar with is the relationship between the abolitionist movement and questions of women's rights and women's equality. Similarly, women were involved in enormous petition drives in the 1830s against slavery. And the petition here is from the female citizens of Pennsylvania. And anti-slavery activism, abolitionism was a very radical movement, in large part because it involved both men and women, as well as white men and women and Black men and women. And so it was mixed groups. And this was something that was seen as shocking. And so women involved in this, Black and white women, were pushing a number of boundaries. So by trying to use these petitions, women were trying to say slavery is bad, use their moral authority to influence Congress to make the right decision about it. Well, it didn't work, right? They were ignored. And in fact, Congress passes a law in 1836 known as the gag rule that says that they're not even going to consider any of these petitions anymore. Right? So women's one political voice is really silenced. So a number of women began to think, well, maybe we do need the vote. Right? Maybe that's the way to have direct influence. And so by 1848, which is often where the story begins, with the Seneca Falls Convention, this call for the right to vote is getting louder. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention is not the first time women asked for the vote, but it is the first women's rights convention. And the vote is not the only thing that the women are considering there. They come up with a list of grievances that they base on the Declaration of Independence. So famously, their declaration opens with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And they speak to a wide variety of issues, education, equality in marriage, child custody laws, and the vote is the very last thing they consider, and it's actually quite controversial. They almost don't put it in there until Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous Black man in America at the time and a major abolitionist, supports this. So African-American voices are a really important part of these conversations about the right to vote. Whoop, have you lost me? No, all right, I'm gonna keep going. After the Civil War, there are 3 amendments to the Constitution, and the Constitution is amended in these moments of change, offer real possibility. People think of other ways in which the Constitution might change. So the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th, which grants birthright citizenship, and then the 15th, which says that voting cannot be restricted on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude. Suffragists are hoping that maybe women's suffrage rights can be incorporated into these changes at the same time. And that becomes actually quite controversial. A lot of white politicians think that asking for women's suffrage is going too far, that Black men's suffrage is radical enough, and adding women into this conversation is just going to sink the whole thing. And so there's some hesitancy to include women's rights. But again, it's divided, right? Unfortunately, some white women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony used this moment to advocate for white women's suffrage, really using some racist arguments about why educated middle-class women should be the ones voting before freed slaves and formerly enslaved Black men. They propose a 16th Amendment that eventually will become the 19th, but the same language drawing on that 15th Amendment. They're almost identical, that the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. And again, the strategy in this post-Civil War moment is really to focus on a national amendment. And they're again, in line with these larger changes around the Civil War and Reconstruction. They also begin to theorize, a number of suffragists, something that's called the New Departure, which again is thinking about the constitutional amendments and particularly the 14th Amendment and saying, you know, the right to vote should just be part of citizenship. We are citizens, we'll just go exercise our right to vote. And so in the 1870s, suffragists go to the polls and try to vote. And you see here, Susan B. Anthony is arrested along with a number of other women in Rochester, New York. Sojourner Truth goes to the polls and attempts to vote, but she's turned away. So there's this strategy of just trying to assert the right and have it happen. It doesn't work, again. Either people are arrested or turned away. A woman named Virginia Minor from St. Louis tries to register to vote, is turned away. Her husband, who is a lawyer, decides to make her case a test case, and it's a case, Minor v. Hepperstedt, that goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1875. And the Supreme Court argues that because the 14th Amendment has the word male, as in male voters, in it, that the government did not intend for women to be able to vote despite having citizenship. So after the 1870s, this leaves the movement in kind of a moment of disarray, right? There are deep divisions over the question of race and support for Black men's suffrage. Other groups, so they divide into the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by someone named Lucy Stone. And a number of African-American women joined the American Suffrage Association because it is one that acknowledges that this is going to be a process and that Black men should have the right to vote and that white women and Black women need to support that before demanding their right to vote. But also, again, this New Departure strategy had failed, and so there's a moment of regrouping. How will suffragists fight for the right to vote now? And in Jessica's introduction, she gave you a little bit of a preview. It becomes really a state-by-state struggle. So just enormous numbers of women working on the ground across the country, advocating, trying to get suffrage on the ballot in different referendum, and politicking, right, lobbying for it. And the place where this is a successful strategy is in the American West. First in Wyoming Territory in 1869 is the very first territorial legislature to pass women's suffrage. And then, as you can see, there's sort of an avalanche effect. And suffragists argued this as well, right? That if you could get one state to turn, it would lead to this imitation. And what you also see on this map, and they used maps like this quite a bit, and you can see the sort of symbolic colors, right? With white being suffrage states, full suffrage states, and Black being states where women had no form of suffrage. And the in-between, the gray states are where women had school suffrage, so could vote in elections that had to do with children and education. And again, that kind of black and white is used very frequently, but also really the divide between the American West and then much of the American South is dark. And it's also important to remember that's not just women who aren't voting in those states, but this is also the moment when Jim Crow laws, which are disenfranchising African Americans, are being implemented. So that by the turn of the 20th century, African Americans are virtually completely disenfranchised, African American men in those southern states. And those laws also repress the vote for everyone, so that voter turnout in states with Jim Crow laws is extremely low across the board, even though it's aimed at disenfranchising Black men. And anti-suffragists very much use the fear of African Americans voting to argue against suffrage. And this is particularly effective when it comes to trying to convince southern states to pass women's suffrage legislation. So this state-by-state battle, very successful in the West, less so in the East, and again, in the South, it's particularly difficult. And just some sort of fun examples. Suffragists by the turn of the century are really cleverly using modern technology, as Jessica mentioned, the automobile. They're using the new technology of film. They're using print technology and newspapers. They're very good at public relations and have some really savvy campaigns. The auto voters, I love this. One of the arguments against women voting is they don't have stamina and that they aren't strong enough or independent enough. And so suffragists would partake in these cross-country trips in this new technology of the automobile, driving themselves, sometimes going east to west, sometimes west to east. And you can see in the top of the slide there, women who had traveled from California to deliver a suffrage petition from Californian voters, right? Women could vote in California as of 1911. Bringing this petition to Washington, saying that the voters of California are advocating for women's suffrage more broadly. And these get an enormous amount of press. It brings a lot of positive attention, and it does counter some of these ideas about what women can and cannot do, right? And undermines the stereotypes about their abilities. So up to this point, there's really been this focus for a couple decades on trying to win suffrage at a state level. And the plan is if we win enough states, then the number of congressional delegations that are beholden to female voters will be high enough that eventually Congress will pass an amendment to the Constitution enfranchising all women. And this, again, initially seems to be working if you think about that map. I also want to emphasize that these conversations go beyond the borders of the United States, that this is a global movement. This is an international movement. And this is really exemplified by Carrie Chapman Catt, who you see here. She ends up becoming the president of one of the major national suffrage organizations. And it is she who is president as the amendment will be ratified. But before that, she is the president of the International Suffrage Alliance. And in 1912, she takes a world tour, beginning in Europe and then moving east around the world, visiting suffragists in multiple countries. And you see here that she visits a number of suffragists in China, which had just had a revolution. And some women were enfranchised in China, and certainly there were ideas about women's equality. This is not the Communist Revolution. This is the Republican Revolution of 1911. And these conversations echo back in the United States, where in the New York Tribune photo, you see that white suffragists had multiple meetings with Chinese and Chinese American suffragists in US cities talking about these more global currents. And there, of course, are famously conversations between the British suffragists and British radical Emmeline Pankhurst and American suffragists. And those ideas come back to the United States in multiple forms. In terms of the British radical suffrage activism, a woman named Alice Paul, whom you may have heard of, who had worked with Pankhurst in England, returned to the United States and wanted to really revitalize what she saw as a movement that was a little moribund and a little old-fashioned seeming. And she does this by arguing that the constitutional amendment needs to be revived as a strategy, that waiting on the states was taking too long and something else had to happen. So she announces this new strategy with what is the first in DC, which is a suffrage parade that she organizes the week before, or the day before Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. So she's using this as a moment to really announce a new strategy. She's also using it to steal the attention from President Wilson. And she knows that having a major parade in Washington is going to get all kinds of press, and everyone is there for the inauguration. They're looking for something to do the day before. She gives them this opportunity. And what's really interesting about this parade to me is, again, the way it reveals the multiple voices and the multiple people who are involved in this fight that we don't always hear about. So African-American women ask Alice Paul, they want to be involved in this. She does not want to let them. She sort of resists their efforts because she's worried about alienating Southern white politicians, whom again see women's suffrage really as something that will enfranchise Black women. But African-American women insist. You see the picture here is Ida B. Wells, who's marching with the Illinois contingent. Something, again, that she has to insist on. They wanted her to march with other groups of African-American women at the back of the parade, and she refuses. She said, I came here with Illinois, and that's who I'll march with. Other Black women are in the parade as well, particularly Black college women from Howard University, and the Black sororities, so Kappa Alpha Kappa, and then Delta Sigma Theta sorority is brand new and uses the parade as their first public event. So again, really emphasizing the importance of suffrage and voting rights for Black women. The lawyers are also very well represented in this parade, and in fact, the Washington College of Law, which is now American University's law school, the women of that college, which was a college founded by two women lawyers to train female lawyers who were mostly excluded from other law schools, they are very involved in the planning. They're very involved in the march itself. And Alice Paul will actually eventually go back and take her law degree there in 1925. The woman I want to point out, who's from the Washington College of Law, though, that you may not have heard of, is the woman here, Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, who is a woman of Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, and French heritage, so she's a Native American woman. She's one of the very first Native women to receive her law degree. She takes it at the Washington College of Law, and she marches in this parade with the other women lawyers. And she is interested in suffrage as a way of advocating for and protecting tribal sovereignty, tribal land rights, and treaty rights. And will make those arguments very explicitly. She's asked to march in the parade in sort of feathers and buckskin, right, a sort of stereotype of a Native woman, and she refuses that and marches instead in her law school regalia. The other woman is Inez Milholland, who is the leader of the Washington parade, so the first woman sitting astride this white horse with this star on her brow. She's actually one of the sort of inspirations for Wonder Woman, who comes out of suffrage activism, the idea for Wonder Woman. And Mulholland also was a lawyer She had gone to NYU's law school, which was, again, one of the few that trained women. And again, women in the law and these early female law professionals were extremely important advocates and parts of the suffrage movement. So this push for a national suffrage amendment is announced in this really exciting way. And for the next 8 years, the struggle really focuses on both strategies, both at a national level and at the state level. So, for example, Pennsylvania had a major referendum in 1915 trying to pass suffrage at the state level. It fails, sadly, but Pennsylvania women are also participating in these national moments of activism. And so you see here a group of Pennsylvania women picketing Woodrow Wilson's White House with Alice Paul and her National Women's Party. So participating in both. So finally, in 1919, Congress passes the amendment and sends it out to the states for ratification. And over the course of the next year and a half, the states began to consider it. It becomes really tight. There's some initial approvals fairly quickly in the upper Midwest and the American West. But the Northeast and the South, it's a little trickier. And particularly in the South, many governors and legislatures refuse to even consider it. And it comes down, they need 36 and they're at 35 and they're stalled. And it comes down to Tennessee on that hot August of 1920. And it passes the Tennessee Senate fairly handily, but it comes down, right, these decades of work by generations of women to the Tennessee House, where it passes by a single vote. And if not for that, it may not have been ratified. And this is an incredible moment, right? Huge victory, millions of women enfranchised. But as I mentioned, the amendment only says that the right to vote cannot be restricted by sex. There are still many ways that it can be restricted. So I want to come back to that. I'll say very quickly that, again, as Jessica mentioned, this happens in time for the election of 1920, barely. Women register in droves. The League of Women Voters is founded, you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, to help women who have lived in states where they didn't have suffrage learn how to participate in this process. In the South, Black women are trying to register and are often turned away. And so that leads me, here's Alice Paul celebrating the final state of Tennessee by sewing a gold star on her flag and sort of unveiling it to the world. So, but I do want to end here with this sense that 1920 was not the end of the story. Right, 1920 was in some ways a beginning where a number of women of color who were restricted from voting by other means had to continue to fight. As I mentioned, Southern Black women faced Jim Crow laws that, as we know, will not be addressed until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that some women who had been suffragists in the 1920s continue to advocate for suffrage activism into their 80s in the 1950s, and that a new generation picks it up in the 1950s and 60s. That Native American women are not fully citizens until 1924 in the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. That Asian Americans face strict immigration restrictions. Their very small numbers are even allowed to immigrate to the United States, and those that do are not allowed to have naturalized citizenship. This doesn't change until after World War II. So the story of an advocacy for women's voting rights doesn't end in 1920, but continues into the 1960s and frankly continues into the present day. So I want to end with by thinking about the moment offers us an opportunity. This anniversary of 1920 offers us an opportunity to think about the health of our democracy and think about where people are still facing restrictions to the vote and restrictions to the ballot, and particularly women, and how we can work to fully realize the vision of suffrage activists of equality and full voting rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cahill. I did have one follow-up question for you, which is, you have a book coming out. Please tell us a little bit about this book and where we can get it and when we can expect to see it.
Sure, I'm very happy to. It is coming out. It is out of my hands. It will be out in November, so it makes it under the 2020 squeaks in there. It's called Recasting the Vote: How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. And I talk quite a bit about Native American, Chinese American, Latina, and African American women and their participation and their motivations for advocating for suffrage, and how they both are similar to, but also different from the mainstream white suffragists that we often hear about, as well as from each other. And I use a sort of a collective biography approach. So hopefully it's a fun read.